It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say it took a while to get here. About 48 hours of fighting with Delta to get me on a flight that was booked months ago. My bags are somewhere either in the United States or in Europe, or I would be wearing slightly more professional attire. But hopefully you'll stand it. The other thing is, having come with only the clothes on my back, as well as a handful of things in my carry-on, I just learned last night how long it takes a pair of underwear to hand wash and dry. And I can tell you that 12 hours is not enough. But fortunately, I'm standing rather than sitting, which is in any case, why don't we go ahead and get started? That's not one of my slides, but we're going to go ahead and get started. My apologies for actually. Before we get on, grabbing my laptop from back here so I can watch along with you guys. Oh, thanks a lot. I'm always cognizant as a speaker when you put your head around and suddenly everybody can't hear what you're saying. So I'm going to be talking about messaging against demagogues, and this is most of us in this world who do this kind of speaking kind of move around. That we take talks we've given and then we revise and take a few hours revising them before giving the next speech from the materials that were in there before. This one is not of that sort, because I actually haven't spoken about this before, and it's an incredibly important topic that I was asked to speak about. I just thought I'd begin by showing that one of the two demagogues that I'm most familiar with from being in the United States, and thank you very much, and the good sense that you can get that. I am a psychologist by training, but I was influenced by ethology, which is a branch of comparative psychology and animal functioning with our own, and you can see that the resemblances actually show more on some people than others. So this is going to be the most important slide that I could. If there's anything I want you to walk home with, it is this slide. Don't take it because I'd like to keep my computer. But this is probably the main slide I want you to remember, and that is the progressive fallacy, which is telling the truth versus arousing emotions. We have this idea since the Enlightenment that the way we convey, the way we convince people is through rational appeals. And somehow we forgot this fellow named Aristotle, who I believe comes from this part of the world, if I remember correctly, but who did have this pathos in there along with logos. And it turns out, if you look at the data on what actually predicts people's voting behavior, a great deal of it has to do with values and emotions, as I know we spoke about yesterday. So what I want to show you is that we have this idea, particularly those of us on the left, that there's one action that if you speak the truth, then that's the opposite of being of speaking in a way that's emotionally compelling that demagogues use. And while it is true that demagogues speak falsehood and they do it emotionally, good leaders speak truth and do it emotionally. And so I want to show you the four quadrants that this creates. So you've got, on one hand, emotionally compelling through boring numbers, policy statements, etc. And going across this way, we've got how true what you're saying is. And so let's take a look at these four quadrants. So over in this quadrant, over here, you've got demagogues. And what they essentially do is they tell falsehoods well. And so you can see they're on the side that's false, not true, and they're on the side that's emotionally compelling up here. Is this making sense? And am I speaking at a reasonable rate? I'm always, okay. So that's I mean, I'm going to use Donald Trump as an example, but you certainly have plenty of your own here in Europe. And you know, our democracy is for the first time, I think, struggling in 225 years in a way that we have not before. The way many of your democracies or newly emerging democracies have struggled. We also now have managed to outshine most of you, as I guess you could say, in economic inequality, and there are some good reasons to believe that it's pretty difficult to maintain a democracy the larger the gap becomes between the wealthy and everyone else. But in any case, so there's a demagogue. Now, if we look at the next quadrant, this is our perception of a demagogue. We think that a demagogue is telling lies stupidly. Because to our ears, we hear what he says, we know that it's not true, and it doesn't seem the slightest bit emotionally compelling to us. So this is how it hears to our ears. But our ears are not the ears that matter in politics, obviously. The ears that matter are the ears of the public. Then you've got progressives, and in our DNA as progressives, we have to speak poorly. Or as I put it, the truth told poorly is what we do best, those of us who are on the left. And this is universally true. One of the things I learned from, since writing The Political Brain over the last decade from doing international work, is that across the world, across Europe, all the way to South Korea, Latin America, it is always the left that has the same problem. The idea that ideas are over here, and if somehow they get mixed in with emotion, that makes them impure, and that makes them bad. And therefore, it is better to bore the hell out of people who are voting for you, or who want to vote for you, and to speak as in a way that is as emotionally uncompelling as you possibly can, because we've got to confuse this idea that just because people who lie usually do it in a compelling way, demagogues, that does not mean that those of us, that on our side, we should speak the truth in an uncompelling way. So if you think about the difference between, I couldn't have asked with the second edition of The Political Brain coming up, I couldn't have asked for a better contrast between President Obama and Hillary Clinton, because they believed the exact same things as best as I can tell. She really was running as a second term or third term of Obama, but one of them was able to use rhetoric in a way that made people feel something, and the other was not. And the other also very, very foolishly did not bring in the pollster who knows the most about females in the world, and that is Celinda Lay, who I'll mention back. The very first project that I ever did when I was asked to consult after writing the book was it's the only project I've ever done in my home state of Georgia. It was a branding project for the Democratic Party of Georgia, and they asked me if I would consult, and I said only if I can work with a pollster, so that I can actually test the ideas that that we're going to try out. And they had a bunch of proposals, and Celinda's was obviously not written by Celinda. It was written by, I'd say, someone who's probably 23 years old, and he's kind of trying to pull together what Celinda would have said for this proposal. And there was a great one by another pollster I've worked with, which is great, Stan Greenberg. But I kept looking through the things that Celinda had written, and I said, I want to work with her. And it was because she had an understanding of values and emotions that bar none among the American pollsters. Extraordinary, and unfortunately, why the Clinton campaign did not draw on her knowledge of women, I have no idea. Finally, how to be the demagogue. That's the last quadrant, and that is truth told well. So that is truth told in a compelling way. Again, I want to emphasize this because we do have, particularly those of us on the left, we have this intuitive sense that somehow if we infuse our messages with something that makes people feel something, that we're doing something wrong, that we are somehow being demagogic, that we are somehow being like Donald Trump with that picture on the front page. But it is absolutely not true that just because people who are demagogic use emotion does not mean that good speakers and who are not demagogic do not. And in fact, what we know from a great deal of research stemming back, I'd say about somewhere between around 3 million years to the rise of mammals, is that we follow our emotions. You know, it's what feels like or what we think or associate with being good for ourselves, our families, our countries, our values. That is what we move towards, and we move away from everything that we feel otherwise. And so, sure, the belief matters, but it's that gut level feeling that is drawing us one way or the other. So the second slide that I'd like you to remember almost as much is the first one I call the progressive's fallacy. This one I'll call the progressive's second fallacy, and that is care versus aggression. We progressives tend to think that we should be caring, and it's a terrible idea that we should care about, people who are less fortunate than us, that we should care about people who don't share our gender, that we should care about people who may not share our sexual orientation. In North Carolina, in the United States, that we should care about where transgendered people use the bathroom, which I have to say I can't understand why. I don't know if you've seen any of this, but I remember, and I know Celinda does, that when the Equal Rights Amendment did not pass in the United States between 1972 and 1982, there were 35 states out of the 38 that needed to pass it. And one of the major arguments against it that won the South against it was, well, that means that women are going to be able to use men's bathrooms and men are going to be able to use women's bathrooms. And that was literally the level of argument. Now today we're hearing the same thing in North Carolina about transgendered kids. Whose bathrooms are they used? Honestly, I don't care. You can go out and pee in the forest. It doesn't matter to me. I will mention that, and Celinda has not heard this yet, but I will mention that there is a way to pass the ERA in the United States, Equal Rights Amendment, that could get through the Congress and all of the states within about 2 years, if our leaders decided to embrace it. And that is a version of the ERA, of the Equal Rights Amendment, that recognizes not only the profound gender differences for women over the last 50 years, but since then the profound gender differences for men, which is that men take care of children now in a way that, when I was a kid, dads came home at night, they kicked their feet up, and they played with their kids a little bit for a few minutes, had dinner together, might read them a bedtime story, might throw a ball with them on the weekend, but mom just took care of kids and stayed home. And it's not like that anymore. And there's only one state in the United States where if you divorce, you can, and then this will be foreign to European ears or to many European ears, but there's only one state, California, that if you divorce, the assumption is that the man and the woman will have equal custody of the children. And if you want more than your share of custody, you have to argue for it, whether you're male or female. In the rest of the United States, it goes the other way. And what usually happens is, it means that men are cut out of the lives of their children after a divorce. And what I can tell you is that I have tested with a sample, stratified random sample, 1,000 American voters, what the cover story for it was the idea okay, so the Equal Rights Amendment didn't pass. It's only 3 lines long, by the way. It's a striking thing about amendments to the Constitution, but they're really, really short, except for the 25th Amendment, which we might be evoking on how to get rid of the president when he is psychologically or neurologically incapacitated. But they're usually about 3 lines, as the ERA was. And the cover story was, okay, here's what happened to the ERA. Passed in 35 states. By the way, the 9 of the states that did not pass it were all from my part of the country, the southern United States, where people are much more conservative. Now, it turns out that there is a way to change that. And that is that because those states are more conservative, they're also the most conservative in the way they treat men in custody issues. And in other words, the average, what men typically get in custody in the South is every other weekend and a dinner in between. And, you know, for a 1950s dad, that's what I would have expected if my parents split up, because my mom stayed home until we were old enough that she went back to work, and my dad was out working, but it's not that way anymore. And dads are much more involved, and some fathers prefer the every other weekend, and that's all fine. But it turns out the harshest sentences are given to men in the South. And so that if you actually, when I tested this and I said, here is the Equal Rights Amendment, I showed it to them, told them a little bit about the history. I said, there's a new movement afoot for an Equal Justice Amendment that does the same thing as the Equal Rights Amendment, except it updates the ideas of what men can do. And the 2 differences between it were, and one I learned from research on abortion in the United States. And that is that men feel like they can say whatever they want on it and make women do whatever they want, because they feel like they, I don't know how to translate this aphorism, but they have no skin in the game. That it doesn't matter to them. I mean, because, you know, it's not my body you're monkeying with. It's not my choice you're making a difference with. Well, actually it is. Because, you know, behind every pregnant woman, or in some position with respect to every pregnant woman, is typically a man, unless, you know, it's through in vitro fertilization. And the average abortion is not with a woman who's off making a decision by herself. It is usually, actually, a married couple who are making that decision together. She ultimately makes it, but they discuss it. You know, and the idea of the woman having the right to choose was great language in the 1960s, but now it actually is not the strongest language. And you can make it very strong, but it is so much stronger if you, as in the case of this amendment, everywhere it said, bless you, everywhere it said women, I changed it to men and women. So it was now equal rights, but truly equal for the 21st century. And I added 2 clauses. One was, there shall be no discrimination in the workplace on the basis of sex. They used the word sex in the original ERA, so I kept it rather than gender, and I also thought, let the Supreme Court deal with transgender. Let's not get into that for the moment. And then second, and there shall be no discrimination in the event of the dissolution of a marriage or the fundamental or the functional equivalent thereof in the based on sex. And the typical 20% said they weren't sure about whether there should be an amendment to the Constitution. Between 85, of the other, so now we've got 80% to work with. Between 65 and 78% of Americans, depending on where they lived and demographics, although there were very few demographics, said they believed this should be an amendment to the United States Constitution. We're talking about well beyond what you'd need to sail through any state legislature, because they were equally distributed among Democrats and Republicans. And the strongest support was in the South. And the reason for that was because every woman in the South, just like every man in the South, knows all kinds of men who've lost their children because of simply divorce judges who said, I think you should have the children because you're female. And they all have women, by the way, supported the Equal Justice Amendment 2-to-1 over the Equal Rights Amendment. And the reason they did that is the same reason that if you say, instead of saying about abortion, instead of just talking about a woman's right to choose, if you talk about things like, government shouldn't be telling a woman or family, when a woman or couple, when they should or shouldn't start their family. For some reasons I'll talk about in a second, that's an entirely different statement. One of them is, you've just said to men, you're part of this. You're not over here telling women what to do. This is about, do you want the government telling you when you have to start your family or when you can or can't add an addition to it? As opposed to, there's a woman out here who, however she got pregnant, she's out there getting pregnant, she's out there having lots of sex. It is activating what we'll talk about shortly, a network of associations in our brains and in our minds. A network that is about a woman who is having promiscuous sex. That is, she's having sex with sort of anybody she feels like, whenever she feels like it. And although many people consciously believe that women should be able to choose their partners just like men should, unconsciously, that is not what they believe. The gender differences, the sex differences are enormous. And women judge other women harshly, unconsciously, for having multiple partners, etc., even though many of them, especially millennials, do. Anyway, so the progressive second fallacy, caring versus aggression. We have this idea that progressives care about people, particularly who have less than they do, and that on the other side is the aggression you see in someone like Donald Trump, or the hatred you see in Donald Trump. Well, hatred and aggression are not the same thing, and we make that mistake on the left all the time. And this is another way that the left lets the right define things, and then the left then fights up against them. So I remember when Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, and he used the American flag all of the time and would wave it in all of his commercials so much, to such an extent that I, as an American, started having negative associations to my own flag. The American flag became to me like a symbol of the Republicans. Well, that was absolutely brilliant branding. Because now the flag itself had become something that people on the left were ambivalent about. Well, the flag is neither left nor right. The flag is your country's flag. But they managed, this is always true, that the right with superior branding is almost always defining the terms. This is what, as George Lakoff calls framing, but in marketing, it's called branding, is establishing what's associated with what. So here, let me again show you quadrants. So what I'm suggesting is that caring, you can go from, on the one side, not caring at all about people unlike you, who don't share your ethnicity, who are not as wealthy as you, who are not of your same sex, do not have your same sexual orientation, etc. Or you can care about those people, and what happens to them is of concern to you. That is a fundamental difference between the right and the left. Now there's another orthogonal line, by which I simply mean, for those of you who didn't go to graduate school in political science and drop out and instead become a very wealthy pollster, there's this second axis, and that is how aggressive you are. And we associate that with progressives are unaggressive, and you get increasingly more aggressive the more right-wing you are. And that is often true. But let me show you the quadrants on this one as well. So we start out with the demagogue. And again, I'm going to use Donald Trump as a prototypical example. You've got a bully who's looking to start a fight. He is on the top quadrant, the top side on aggression, but he's really low on the caring side. So especially for people who are not like him, who are people who are women, who are Muslim, who are Mexican, who are Latino, these are people who are all not me, according to Donald Trump. So he couldn't care less about them, and in fact, they become great scapegoats. They become bullies don't just pick fights with people bigger than them. They usually pick fights with people littler than them, or with people with less power than they have. And I've often said that I wish that Barack Obama had been bullied as a child, because I think he would have been a much more effective president. Because he would have understood what you do when the other side says, we intend to block everything that you do. And a good piece of that is because we don't like what you believe, and a good piece of it is because we don't like your skin color. And so, well, instead of letting them go like this and saying, oh, well, let's all get together and let me hold your hand. No, this does not mean I want to hold your hand. It means something quite different. And when you see this go up, that's when these have to go up as a progressive. And so here you've got the bully on one side, in one quadrant, defining it. Then you've got people who are neither particularly caring about, they don't care, they care about their families, they care about people they know, but in terms of politically, they're not thinking about people who are unlike themselves all that much. They are not uncaring, they're just not particularly concerned, and they're not particularly aggressive, they're not racist, they don't, they don't particularly hate people, they're sort of neither. But a demagogue can activate those people and get them with him by talking about, for example, building a wall to keep all those people out who are bringing all this terrible stuff into our country. The remarkable thing is that demagogues, and in the U.S., you see this everywhere, but in the U.S. example, the idea that in the immigration battles over the last 20 years, in which we could have passed comprehensive immigration reform if leaders had actually taken a look at the research that was getting done on how to talk to people from right to left, because actually, as I'll be talking about this in a master class later, the same language is effective for the right and the left on immigration. And you can get both to support comprehensive immigration reform, but you have to do it in a very particular way. You have to do it with a series of values that include values that appeal to people across the political spectrum. And I didn't have this in the talk, but that's something else I do want to emphasize, and that is that your messaging, when you're messaging against the demagogue, because their messaging is Manichaean, it's black and white, it's those evil immigrants versus the rest of us. What you want to do is to bring in multiple values that cut across the political spectrum. because in fact, conservatives do not all hate. Yes, many of them hate, but they also do care. And in the United States, for example, many conservatives use their Christianity to define their conservatism, or to help explain their conservatism, to say why they're conservative. And there was this fella named Jesus who did say that you should be nice to other people. And one of the toughest things for Democrats in the South, and one of the most frequent questions I get from Democrats running for office in the South, is, what do I do when my opponent calls me a liberal? Because that's the kiss of death in the South. And being a liberal, really, I'll show you the associations to it in a moment. But being a liberal is the worst thing you can be in the South. So what I often ask them is, well, what religion are you? And in the South, 90+% are Christian. And I'll say, are you practicing? They say, yeah, I do believe, and they're they have various religious beliefs. And I'll say, well, are you comfortable saying, not endorsing a religion, but, I'll ask it this way, and this says a lot about messaging. I'll ask them, well, are you comfortable quoting Shakespeare in your speeches? Say, yeah. All right. Are you comfortable quoting, the New York Times? Yeah. Are you comfortable quoting the Wall Street Journal? Yeah. Are you comfortable quoting the Bible? Are you comfortable quoting the Koran? Well, in the United States, that's not the greatest idea in the South, but we'll put that aside for a second. So if they're comfortable quoting the Bible, then there's an easy way to respond when someone says, he's a liberal! And that is that you say in response, I think my opponent and I probably went to Sunday school in a pretty similar church. And I recall this parable where this fellow named Jesus was asked about what to do when somebody's suffering in a way that you're not. And he said, if your brother has 2 coats and you have none, give your brother one of your coats. Now my opponent over here would say instead, if you have 2 coats and your brother has none, steal his pants. That's the difference. If that makes me a liberal, then Jesus and I are liberals, and I'm happy to be on that side. And that's a tough thing to come back to, because in fact, if you're on the side of lower taxes for working people and higher taxes for people who have a lot of money, you're actually a lot closer to that, to the teachings of Jesus, or frankly, virtually any great political leader in any, a religious leader in any tradition. So you've got demagogues, then you've got politically disinterested, then you've got, once again, us. That we are high on caring, but we're low on aggression. So I call that cares without cojones. If you don't know the... Oh, it isn't. Thank you. I've misspelled that, and people caught me on it multiple times before. Thank you for the... see, it's great to come to Europe, where there's... are you from Spain or
Argentina.
Oh, perfect. All right, excellent. I should know this from having done some work in Venezuela and in Brazil, but not Argentina. So maybe that's why I forgot it was in the sea. But I'll let, what's your name? I'm sorry.
Felipe.
I'll let Felipe explain to any of you who don't know what cojones means after the talk. But I would call this impotent progressivism. This is progressivism without balls. This is, to put it colloquially, the only, in my experience, the Democrats who have balls in the United States tend to be female. I don't know what happens to the men. I think that if you enter Congress, there's a ritual process that occurs the night before you're sworn in, where you have to remove your balls and put them somewhere else if you're a Democrat. But the idea of fighting back is something we progressives have this idea that somehow that makes us like them. That makes us as bad as them. And I'll tell you, this idea of they take the low road so we take the high road is a really great way to taking no road in politics other than losing. And because if the other side is making effective attacks on you, and you're saying, well, I'll turn the other cheek and I won't attack back, that's probably not terribly helpful. So, and now I realize how much time I have. So, finally, is the quadrant of the powerful progressive. And that is that beating a bully equals care plus aggression. And that is, if somebody attacks you, you attack back, and you attack back stronger than they attacked you. That does not take away the fact that you care about a large group of people. In fact, it reinforces it. And the best example I can give you is the labor movement. And labor has different meanings all over the world. But in the United States, labor started out as, we had this group, for example, the Brotherhood of Teamsters. The idea of a brotherhood was about caring for each other. We were all taking care of each other. But you didn't associate Teamsters with being weak. You associated them with having their hands up ready to fight if they needed to fight. And they were going to fight for what mattered to them. And we, on the left, have a little trouble with that. Finally, populism, good, bad, or either. This is an important point to make, because right now we're seeing right-wing populism emerge all over the place, and we're often referring to populism as if it's a bad thing. Populism historically tends to emerge on the left and the right at the same time. And right now we're just seeing a lot of right-wing populism in large measure because what is preventing left-wing populism is that leaders on the left are bought off by corporations. And that's why you're not seeing people standing up enough on the left for the average person. And the definition of a populist, well, here's a populist, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Here's something he said back in the 1930s. It's hard to imagine a progressive Democrat in the United States saying today. No business which depends for existence on paying less than living wages for its workers has any right to continue in this country. And by living wages, I mean more than a bare subsistence level. I mean the wages of decent living. That is populism. And what populism basically says is, in essence, this is also populism. This is angry populism. And that's what we have a lot of right now. And the right is appealing to it, but the left is not. And that is one of the biggest problems that we have. I don't think there are many of us who would say, no, concentration of wealth and power in a handful of people is a good idea. Most of us are on the other side of that. But for various reasons, it's the right that is speaking like populists, even if, as in Donald Trump's case, he's cutting taxes for the rich now and doing everything possible that could hurt the people he claimed he was trying to help. So here's another one of these sets of quadrants. You've got on the one side populism, which goes from corporatism through populism, and then you've got racism through inclusion. These are completely separate things, and so that populism, whether it's left or center, is about the idea that people who produce wealth should get some share of it, and should get some reasonable share of it, which is something that I think virtually everyone believes, except for the small handful of people who are corporatists, who are gaining from everybody else's labor. And this is Bernie Sanders. This is why Bernie Sanders did so well in the United States. I mean, I say this as someone who's Jewish by background. A Jewish guy with a thick Brooklyn accent with hair that looks like he hasn't combed it in 150,000 years was not a good competitor for Hillary Clinton. The fact that he came close to her and made that a race in the primaries was unbelievable. And if there had been a strong left-wing populist candidate, the Democrats would have won that election really, really hard. But here's right-wing populism. Right-wing populism is nothing but populism plus racism. That equals right-wing populism. And I want to make this distinction because we're associating populism with right-wing populism right now. And populism has nothing to do with racism, except when it's done on the right and it's done for political purposes. That what you do is that you say, as a left-wing, or I'd call it a middle-wing populist does, because, most people, if you think about the bell-shaped distribution of income that we ought to have, it actually looks like this, but if it's supposed to look like this, most people are in here. So they actually are, quote-unquote, left-wing in this sense, in their populism, that they think that, all right, people in here should get a reasonable share of what they produce. What right-wing populists say is they'll say the same thing. They'll say the rich are ripping you off. But then they'll say, and it's those Mexicans. And you better watch out for those Syrians who are crossing over the border. So that's what right-wing populism does. It simply adds racism to populism. Then you've got the traditional right, which is low on higher on racism and high on corporatism. And that was, in the United States was we called it dog whistle politics, where you would send out messages that let people know, this actually just happened are many of you familiar with the special election that's happening right now in Georgia for a district that should not even be considered? I actually worked in this district once. It shouldn't even be in the running for a Democrat, and certainly not for a Democrat who actually has no background whatsoever. He's 30 years old, he's a kid. I think he still uses acting cream. But he came close to winning without a runoff, and if he just gotten 2 more points, then we would have a Democratic senator from Georgia, a Democratic member of Congress from Georgia. But there was a reason why I mentioned him.
Dog whistle.
I'm sorry?
Dog whistle.
One more time?
You were talking about dog whistle.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes. So this is literally the ad campaign, thank you, that his opponent, Karen Handel, is running. All of the ads are, vote for Karen Handel, she's one of us. Well, who is us? In that district, it's a bunch of white people. But they don't say, vote with us white people. They just say, she's one of us. That, I have to say, is one of the most blatant examples of that kind of messaging that we've seen since Nixon and Reagan talked about able-bodied welfare loafers and welfare queens driving their Cadillacs, which was a way of saying that this other side over here just cares about black people. Don't worry, we white people, we're with Reagan and Nixon. Then you've got socially progressive but corporatist at heart. And this, I believe, was the biggest reason that was self-inflicted that Hillary Clinton did not win. There were many reasons that were not self-inflicted. But one of the biggest ones that is that this was an election that a populist was going to win. This was not an election where people wanted someone whose sympathies were at least as much on the corporate side as they were. I mean, when you're the former senator of Wall Street, good luck running as a populist. You're not going to be able to do it. So let me wrap up with telling the truth well. And how do you do that? Can I go on for about 3 more minutes, or is that going to impose a time?
Go ahead.
Is that all right? Okay. So, there's really 3 things you need to know about telling the truth well, which is what we should be doing against that's that very first slide. That's what you do against a demagogue. You speak in emotionally compelling ways and you speak the truth. And I will tell you that the first thing that I always say to clients is that the one thing I will not do is in messaging is I will not say anything that I do. I will not test a message that I believe has any falsehood in it whatsoever. All of the facts are going to be facts that have been checked. And the right doesn't do that. But you know, you can win just as well with true things said in emotionally compelling ways. And in fact, you can win better with them because people actually know them to be true at some level. So I wish I could show you this example from, I'll skip over it. The main point here is that the more that you can speak to people in ways that they can feel it, then the more likely you are to win. And then if you can't feel it, don't use it. Because if it doesn't make your heart pound, it's not going to make anybody else's. And here's an example. You could say, there's a rising income inequality in the United States, as we hear all the time. Well, you know what? That puts me to sleep unless I'm an economist or I'm politically involved, which we all are. But if you talk about rising inequality, you know, to the average person, it's like, yeah, that's a bad thing. But you don't see a lot of feeling attached to it. Here's the way you see a lot of feeling attached to it. You say, you know, every time a CEO cuts himself a $3 million bonus, he's just cut the income of 1,000 of his workers by $3,000 apiece. Now that gets people mad, and that is left-wing populism that, frankly, should get people mad. In the United States, we have a 300 to 400 to 1 ratio of how much the average executive makes to the average person working in that company. You know, in Japan, it's what, 10%? Between 10 and 15%? In most civilized countries, you know, like as here in Europe or these days, you know, our rate of inequality is making Latin America look really, really good. And you guys have really been pulling yourselves up in this respect, and we've been pulling ourselves down. And we're creating the conditions for anti-democratic movements to arise by doing that. But you know what I just said? Every time that CEO cuts himself a $3 million check, a bonus, he's cutting the salaries of 1,000 of his workers by $3,000. You know what? That, I can tell you that tests off the charts. Where that came from? I did the math one day. It's like, wait a minute, $3 million. 1,000 times 1,000 is 1,000,000. So a $3 million bonus means 1,000 times 3,000. So if he's got 1,000 workers, well then he could have distributed that money in a very different way. He could have given half of it to him and the other executives, and then split the rest among the people working in the company. He would have had a lot of loyal people working in that company. The second principle is tell a story, and I'll stop with this one. But the structure of an effective message, as I've seen it, I have never tested, now out of testing just about 1 million messages with about 100,000 Americans, and I have been so delighted and privileged to work with people like Celinda and most of the Democratic pollsters in the United States, from whom I have learned and continue to learn a tremendous amount. The structure of an effective message that I've seen is this, and I'll stop with this, and that is this. I have never seen a message win that did not have this structure. And it begins by connecting with the person you're trying to connect with. Typically using a value-laden statement, or a statement with a number of values, or an analogy that people can say, yeah, I see that. So just to give you an example of that, and I'll talk about this later this afternoon for those of you who are interested. In talking about immigration in the United States, a terrific first line of a narrative is, you know, like any other country, we here in America have the right to decide who lives within our borders based on our interests and our values. Now, there is no one, left or right, who disagrees with that statement. I have just made a statement, which is that people within a country should get to choose who lives in their country. Is there anyone who doesn't agree with that? I mean, maybe someday we'll have completely open borders among the world, and we'll all be singing together in harmony. But that's not where we are right now, and that's not a controversial statement. What would have been controversial, and I can tell you from doing online dial testing, which I did with Linda, where people are listening to messages and moving a dial this way if they like what they're hearing, and this way if they don't, that I said, based on our interests and values, the dials go up. If I said, based on our values and interests, the dials go down, you lose everybody right of center. I see Christina standing up, so I will quickly zip through the other two. Second is that you raise concerns. You describe the problem in a way that is as vivid and concrete and visual as you could possibly make it, so that people feel it viscerally, they feel it in their gut, and they're concerned about it, either they're worried or they're angry. And you have to activate one of those two emotions if you want them to make things change. And especially if you're progressive, you want things to change, which means you believe something is worrisome or something should make you angry. That means, by definition, that's what you're trying to do. And finally, you always end with a hopeful solution and a return to those values or that analogy that you began with, so that you bookend your message. So it starts with values people share. It then describes what's the concern. And then it ends with returning to, we actually can solve this problem. But what we do on the left is we then say, and let me give you my 10-point plan for how I'm going to do it. That is not an effective way to do it. If you frankly give one example, that beats a 10-point plan all of the time, if it is a compelling example. I will stop with that. I've got some, I did have some video I was going to show you if I hadn't taken so much time to get up through this many slides, although this is an improvement for me, believe it or not. I actually only prepared 8 or 9 slides instead of my usual 350. Now, Celinda can get through, but I can't. So thank you very much for listening. Preferably from a demagogue.
What's principle number 3?
Oh, okay. Principle number 3 was about knowing what networks in the mind or brain that you're activating. And that is the difference between, for example, just to use an example, going back to that example of abortion. If you say a woman's right to choose, unconsciously you are activating a network about women who are out there having indiscriminate sex. If you say instead, I don't like the government telling women or couples when they should or shouldn't start their families, activating a network about families. That is over here, that's positive. Who doesn't like families? And it is also re-enfranchising men on an issue that is that they have felt disenfranchised on. Well, let me put it a different way. They feel like they can opine on whatever should happen to women. But I'll tell you, one of the biggest mistakes that Hillary Clinton made was not thinking about what network she was activating when she talked about being a woman. She had gone more to Pennsylvania and to and to Ohio and to West Virginia, where we have a lot of men out of work from the steel industries, and the coal industries, and said, listen, you know me as someone who's fought for women my entire life. You know that I've been someone who's fought for children, particularly for poor children my entire life. You know that something that's really important to me is that your wives, your sisters, and your daughters are getting paid 79 cents on the dollar for what a man is getting. Notice I just put in your wives, your sisters, your daughters. You're now saying to them, this is about, we're all us. This is not us and them, males against females. This is all of us, because who doesn't want their child paid well? I don't care whether my child is male or female. I want her treated well. But then if she had simply said, but listen, I've been through this country, through this part of the country. I've spoken with so many of you who haven't had a job in a number of years now, who want nothing more than to go back to work, and whose identity is about being someone who can take care of your family and bring money home. And what I want to say to you is, while I will make sure that your children, that your wives and that your sisters and that your daughters do not make just 79 cents on the dollar as a man, I will equally make sure that you do not make 0 cents on the dollar, and that we're going to get you back to work. That's a statement that she never made and got out there, and that activating a network that says, wait a minute, feminism is not incompatible with caring about men. And it's also saying that caring about women is not something that only women should do. It's something that all of us not only should, but do naturally. Someone had one other comment or question I thought maybe.
Yeah. Nicholas?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Well, you wanted a demagogue or someone provocative. No, I just have one question. If you consider populism not as a political category, but as a register of discourse, couldn't you, perhaps also state that the structure of an effective message is the structure of a populist message? If you take these three elements, connect, raise concerns, and end with a hopeful solution, isn't this basically what a performing populist is actually achieving?
A fascinating question. This is a message that works in economics, and so in populism, certainly. But what I found is that it works on climate change. It works on the rights of people who are gay and lesbian and transgender to have marriage equality. It works on virtually every issue. And you can see, like with climate change, one of the things that we've learned is very often you don't even start with climate. And I think someone, we did this project together for Echo America and the NRDC and a number of organizations, where one of the messages we tested was one. I remember the client looking at me when he saw it and saying, "Are you crazy?" Because it began with the words, "My family's health makes a lot of difference to me." And they said, "What the hell does that have to do with climate change?" I said, "Well, read on." And the next sentence says, when the American Lung Association tells us that half of us are getting our lungs damaged by pollution, then we have something to be concerned about. And then it makes the transition. And so first it starts out with, my family's health is something that matters to me. That's first. Second, it goes to, wait a minute, I'm concerned about my kids' lungs. I'm concerned about my lungs. Well, now you move into, I can remember a time when tobacco scientists would come on television with their white lab coats and tell us that sure, you can breathe all this black soot up into right up into your lungs and you'll be just fine. Nothing will happen to you at all. Well, we have a lot of dead people because of that. Well, the idea, think about what happens to that black soot when it goes past your nose, past your lungs, and into the atmosphere. And now we are having those same industry-paid scientists with their white lab coats telling us, so we put a few hundred billions of tons of black soot into the air. Don't worry, it won't hurt the atmosphere or the environment at all. Now you've got people with you, because what you've just done is not only to create that metaphor, tobacco and now oil, but you've also now created a visual image that you've got black soot going into your nose and your lungs. Well, where the hell does that soot go afterwards? It keeps going up. And that's something that people can readily see, they readily get, and that brings us back to something again that the rest of the world is doing that we're not, which is developing alternative energies that actually are sustainable. And my hat's off to so many of you and your leaders. And I'll actually end with that with a final statement, and that is in terms of activating networks. Whenever you refer to the other side, to the people who are leading them, call them politicians. People hate politicians. When you refer to the leaders on your side, talk about leaders, because people love leadership. The only thing I'd add to that is, you gotta mean it. And that's the difference between demagoguery and non-demagoguery, is that one side is about leadership and really meaning it, and the other side is about playing people off politically against each other, or saying things that sound populist, that is for the people, but actually that is not what you intend whatsoever.
This is Özlem from Istanbul, Turkey. I just want to ask, is this a learnable task? I mean, can you teach someone who has a low level of EQ or emotional empathy characteristics? Can you teach them how to, connect, message? One question is that. And another thing is that when we choose someone, I mean, winning is something, running morally is another thing. Winners don't always run morally. So what do we do about this?
Okay, so the first question is about emotional intelligence. I'm really glad you brought that up. So we're actually talking about two issues about. One is that one of the main points in what I'm saying that I did not get a chance to put up was that the point is not to dumb down our messages. It's actually to increase their emotional intelligence. It's to basically say, let's speak to people in a way that is emotionally more intelligent, that speaks to their emotions as well as their thinking. And if your question is, can you teach people this? Well, it certainly helps to start out being emotionally intelligent. And one of the things I learned when I first got into doing political consulting was that the people who understood immediately what I was talking about, number one, people in Hollywood, who tell stories all the time. Everything that they're doing is storytelling and speaking to people's emotions. But you know what? Most of those people actually are pretty progressive. And a lot of the only reason that we now have marriage equality in the United States is because, I don't know if this is a secret, but it's because a group of really, really sharp leaders of the what was then called gay rights movement, which was a mistake, became the marriage equality movement, went to the Screenwriters Guild in Los Angeles, they're a union, so they can work as a union, and they agreed they would not write for any television show that did not either portray a gay or lesbian couple who were dealing with the same issues as those people, as heterosexuals, in raising a family and in their relationships and all that kind of stuff. Or if they did have stereotypic characters, that those stereotypic characters were lovable, that they were people who you liked. And by doing that, they brought into everybody's living room, night after night after night, people who were gay, who were lesbian. They almost got to trans, but they'll get there. But they brought in gay and lesbian people who were just like, quote unquote, us. And these were people who were center or right of center. And it made a sea change in difference. It is the only issue in the United States where we've actually seen progress in the last decade, as opposed to things going backward. So the question about teaching is that with colleagues, I've done a number of workshops for members of Congress, for young elected officials, for aspiring officials. But I will say, and in fact, you can teach these principles, but I'll tell you 2 or 3 things that I've learned just from practical experience working with members of Congress. One of them is, you don't just work with the leader. You also work with their chief of staff. So if you've got say a progressive wing of your parliament, and you want to do a training in this kind of thing, to how to speak like this, you speak first, you do the training with them, or you talk with them about messaging this way. You then, and you have them practice it. You then work with their chiefs of staff, and then you work with the communications directors. If you just work with the members of Congress or Parliament, you will fail. And even working with all 3, you will fail if you don't do it on a regular basis. Because progressives in our DNA, we just keep coming back to, if we use emotion, we're bad. If we just lay out our 10-point plan, everyone will rationally see that it makes sense. And that if we fight back when the other side is fighting us, we're also bad. And that's immoral. And to come back just to your last question, do we sometimes do immoral things in politics and win? Sure. But can we win in our messaging by being completely truthful? Absolutely. And one of the big challenges, well, I'll leave that alone, but I've never seen a situation where telling the truth well has lost to telling a falsehood well. And that, I think, is our greatest possibility in responding to demagogues.